The night air over Sagebrush Valley had the thick, smoky weight of something ancient and unspoken, the kind of night that whispered warnings before screaming them. Inside the Dawson house, all was still, until Ellie woke with a jolt. At first, it was the distant rhythm of pounding hooves that stirred her, dull thuds against hard earth echoing like war drums through the floorboards. Then came the smell, burning wood, acrid and sharp, snaking its way through the cracks beneath her door. 12-year-old Ellie Dawson flung off the covers and ran barefoot to the window. Her breath caught. Fire clawed at the walls of the barn, flames licking the night sky, casting wild shadows that danced across the ranch like ghosts. And within the chaos, a black shape thrashed violently against the inside of the stall, eyes wide, mouth stretched in a silent cry. It was Shadow, her Mustang. By the time she reached the front porch, her mother, Sarah Dawson, was already there, screaming into the phone, her other hand trying desperately to hold Ellie back. But Ellie didn't stop. Her bare feet slapped against the dirt path, embers stinging her skin as she ran toward the inferno, instinct pushing her harder than any thought could. Somewhere in the chaos, she heard Mabel Whitmore's voice, elderly, panicked, shouting for help and pleading with dispatch. The heat blistered Ellie's face as she pushed against the warped barn door, coughing through the smoke. Shadow was still inside, trapped behind the half-collapsed gate of his stall. She called his name, her voice hoarse but unwavering, and for a moment the wild Mustang stilled, ears flicking toward her. She saw the terror in his eyes, real, human-like, and somehow she knew he recognized her, not just as a caretaker, but as something more. The lock was seared hot, half melted, but she forced it open with her sleeve-wrapped hand. The stall gave way, and Shadow exploded forward, nearly knocking her down as he bolted through the smoke. Ellie stumbled after him, both of them emerging from the flames just as the roof began to cave. Sarah dropped the hose and sprinted to her daughter, pulling her into a fierce embrace as fire crews roared into the yard. Mabel, her flannel coat thrown over her nightgown, stood frozen at the fence line, hand clasped over her heart. She watched as Ellie collapsed next to Shadow in the grass, wrapping her arms around his trembling neck. Neither girl nor horse moved for a long time. 3 days earlier, the world had been quiet. Rising Dawn Equine Center had hosted an emergency rescue auction after their financial collapse. Dozens of horses, many once part of therapy or training programs, were being sold off to whoever had cash in hand. Most bidders were ranchers, breeders, or opportunists looking to flip a strong Mustang for labor. Ellie, dressed in jeans 2 sizes too big, and her late father's old leather jacket, stood at the far end of the auction ring clutching a battered tin lunchbox. Inside it was everything she had, $214.17 saved from birthdays, chores, and Christmas money. It wasn't enough. Not for a healthy horse, but she wasn't there for one of those. Lot number 27 was brought out last. Shadow, the handler muttered. Estimated 9 years old, previously part of a therapy training program, unreliable responses, possible neurological complications, not recommended for beginners. The crowd barely looked up. The black Mustang that limped into the ring looked like a shadow of himself. Ribs visible, one ear torn. A jagged scar ran from his temple down to his jaw. His head hung low, as though he'd already accepted whatever end was coming. The auctioneer tried to start bidding at $200, but no hands rose. $150? Silence. Do I hear 100? The words barely faded when Ellie's hand shot up. 100, she said, voice cracking but firm. The murmurs rippled through the crowd. Someone snorted. Kid's gonna get herself killed. The auctioneer hesitated. Do I hear 150? Anyone? When no one answered, he sighed. Sold to the young lady, lot 27. Ellie's hands trembled as she approached the booth to sign the paperwork. Shadow hadn't looked at her once, but something had pulled her in, something wordless. It wasn't pity, it was recognition. Sarah had been furious. She hadn't even known her daughter was at the auction until the call came from the clerk. She drove to the fairgrounds in a storm of disbelief, but when she saw Ellie standing in front of the bruised Mustang, eyes full of defiance and hope, she didn't scream. She just exhaled and asked, "How are we going to feed him?" "I'll figure it out," Ellie whispered. "He's meant to be here." Shadow arrived at the Dawson Ranch 2 days before the fire. His gait was uneven, his responses inconsistent, but he never snapped, never bucked. He just watched Ellie, like he was waiting for her to understand something even he couldn't explain. "Burn patterns are too clean," she muttered. "Accelerant, probably gasoline." Beside her, Mabel cleared her throat. "I might have caught something. I set up a trail cam last week, had some raccoons raiding my compost bin, got sick of it." Halbrook raised an eyebrow. "Where?" "North Post, faces the back paddock, just catches the corner of the barn." An hour later, Mabel sat beside Ellie and Sarah at the kitchen table, holding her iPad with shaky hands. The screen flickered, showing grainy footage of the barn, still whole, still sleeping beneath moonlight. Then a figure appeared, tall, male, wearing a dark jacket and gloves. He crouched near the barn wall. A faint glow bloomed, then vanished. The man walked away. Moments later, smoke. "That's not a coincidence," Sarah said, her voice tight. "No," Halbrook agreed. "This wasn't an accident." Ellie didn't speak. She couldn't. Her eyes were locked on the screen, heart hammering. Someone had tried to kill Shadow, and she intended to find out why. By morning, the smoldering ruins of the barn stood like a grave marker in the open air, ash swirling with every gust of wind, the scent of smoke still sharp in every breath. Though the fire had been extinguished, its echoes lingered, not just in the scorched wood and warped metal, but in the silence that pressed down on the Dawson Ranch like a weighted blanket. Ellie sat at the edge of the paddock wrapped in one of her father's old flannel jackets, her eyes red-rimmed and unmoving, Shadow resting nearby with a slow, uneven breath, and the kind of watchful stillness that didn't come from calm, but from exhaustion layered over trauma. Sheriff Dana Halbrook returned just after sunrise, her cruiser crunching over gravel as she parked near the remnants of the barn. With the methodical calm of someone used to picking through aftermaths, she walked the perimeter, crouching now and then to examine burn trails and remnants that most would overlook. She paused at the hinge of Shadow's stall door, blackened, twisted from heat, but unmistakably marked by a pattern that didn't match the randomness of an electrical fire or accident. With a gloved hand, she ran her fingers over the melted metal and spoke low, mostly to herself, though her voice was audible in the morning hush. The way the flames spread, the chemical patterns left behind, it didn't add up to chance. It pointed to something else, something deliberate. An accelerant. Arson. Inside the kitchen, Ellie sat at the table gripping a mug of cocoa she hadn't touched. Her hands, though cleaned of soot, trembled slightly around the ceramic. Mabel Whitmore, wrapped in a heavy shawl, tapped at a battered tablet with unsteady fingers. Sarah, her mother, paced the floor, balancing her phone against her shoulder as she made urgent calls trying to salvage her work schedule around the chaos. The house, once filled with the low hum of morning routine, now pulsed with tension and unanswered questions. Ellie finally broke the silence, her voice hoarse and edged with fatigue. When she asked Mabel about the motion-triggered camera, her neighbor only nodded solemnly. The device had been mounted days earlier, more out of precaution than suspicion, but it had caught something the night before. The footage had uploaded before the camera itself had melted in the heat. Together, they watched the video on the tablet's small screen. The night vision footage was grainy, but the image was unmistakable. A figure, tall and purposeful, moved across the edge of the barn with movements too smooth to be impulsive. In one hand, he held something, a small container or canister that gleamed briefly in the moonlight. He knelt, poured a line of liquid near the wall, and then struck something. A flare, perhaps, that ignited the line in a pulse of flame. Seconds later, the screen filled with white distortion as fire consumed the frame. Mabel's jaw tightened, and Sarah turned away. But Ellie leaned in closer, not shrinking from the horror, but searching it for clues. There was something cold and calculated in the man's movement, as if he had done this before, as if he knew exactly where to strike. When Sarah asked who could possibly want to harm a horse, Ellie's thoughts drifted back, not just to the fire, but to the first moment she had seen Shadow. At the Rising Dawn auction, the world had felt frayed and windblown. The kind of day where the dust didn't settle and the air held a faint static charge. Horses shifted nervously in pens, their eyes wide and their coats dulled by months of neglect. Shadow had been at the far end of the lot, barely visible in the shadow of the pen, ribs prominent, a long scar raking the side of his face like a slash from an old blade. The handwritten sign had labeled him as unsuitable. Neurological risk, unresponsive to stimuli, a poor therapy candidate. But when Ellie had stopped at his pen, his head had lifted, and his gaze had met hers. It wasn't the wary glance of a cornered animal, nor the hopeful curiosity of one seeking rescue. It was something more ancient, something buried in both of them. She hadn't known what moved her hand upward, but before she'd fully grasped the consequences, her number had been called, and the auctioneer had barked the words, "Sold." And now, after the fire, the footage and the dread lodged deep in her ribs, Ellie began to understand. This wasn't just about a horse. It was about something much larger. Later that afternoon, while Mabel and Sarah remained occupied with investigators and insurance paperwork, Ellie returned to what little remained of the barn's outer rooms. Among the debris, the old tack room, protected somewhat by its stone walls, had survived. Dust coated every surface, and smoke still clung to the air, but some of her father's things remained untouched. With slow, reverent hands, she opened the old feed trunk tucked beneath the saddle rack. Beneath cracked tack, a rusting curry comb, and a bundle of worn leads, she found it. Her father's leather-bound training journal, the cover still bearing the faded title, "In Harmony with Mustangs." She flipped through pages that carried the scent of old hay and sweat, filled with her father's looping, precise handwriting. Observations about gait patterns, about patience, about instinct over control. Then, near the back, a section she didn't remember reading before, one labeled MERP. The acronym pulsed on the page like a siren. Underneath, in a paragraph carefully penned, were entries about Shadow. Her father had described the horse's heightened cortisol sensitivity, his unusual ability to pick up on emotional fluctuations in handlers, and his peculiar behavior during group sessions. There was one line that chilled her more than any. Shadow responds to stress as if he feels it secondhand. Recoils from panic, gravitates toward calm. If properly developed, potential to detect early neural disruptions in humans. A shiver passed through her. The Mustang Early Response Project. Her father had barely spoken about it, but now she recalled one night long ago. She had overheard him arguing with someone over the phone. His words were sharp and low. He'd said, "These aren't machines. You don't push them until they break, especially not him. Ellie showed the journal to Mabel that evening, and the old woman's eyes narrowed as she read. "Your father never liked those men," she said softly. "They came with contracts and clipboards, wearing suits too nice for a ranch. They talked about funding, about data collection. But your father, he just wanted to help the kids and the animals, never to use one against the other." Ellie leaned forward. "Do you think they came back?" "I think someone never stopped watching," Mabel said, her voice tight. "And when they saw Shadow again, alive, healing, they realized their loose end wasn't so loose after all." That night, Ellie sat beside Shadow's temporary enclosure, her breath fogging in the cool air. He stood near her now, still thin, still haunted, but no longer flinching at every rustle. There was trust building in the silence between them, layer by slow layer. She pressed her palm to the fence and whispered to the darkness, "I don't know what they did to you, but I know you didn't deserve it. We're going to find out everything, and we're going to stop them." Unseen above the valley, a small black drone hovered in the cloud cover, its lens blinking red as it silently turned back toward the ridge. The wind picked up. The storm wasn't coming. It had already begun. The days that followed settled into a strange rhythm, as though the ranch itself was holding its breath, waiting. The remnants of the fire had been cleared away, but the smell of ash still clung to the earth, and the air held a tension that neither wind nor sun could quite dissolve. Sarah worked longer hours at the clinic, throwing herself into distraction. Mabel lingered near the paddock more often, always alert, her eyes sweeping the horizon with a practiced kind of suspicion. And Ellie, as if propelled by an invisible current, spent every waking moment with Shadow, determined to uncover whatever her father had once seen in the Mustang before everything had gone so wrong. Shadow, too, was changing. Though the scar across his face would always remain, the listless haze that had clouded his gaze in the early days had begun to lift. He no longer stood pressed to the far corner of his paddock. Instead, he tracked Ellie's movements with quiet attention, shifting when she shifted, stepping closer each time she offered a hand. He still flinched at sudden noise, and his body remained thin and twitchy from whatever trauma had carved itself into his bones. But something deeper was beginning to stir behind his eyes. Ellie began keeping her own journal now, a spiral notebook worn at the edges. Each day, she recorded his reactions to different voices, tones, sounds. She had read and reread her father's entry on cortisol responses, how Shadow seemed to absorb emotion rather than merely react to it. So she tested it. She played music near the paddock. Calm piano, gentlefolk. Shadow relaxed. She let Mabel read aloud from old poetry books, and Shadow drifted closer. But when Sarah arrived home tense and frustrated, the Mustang's entire frame would lock tight, nostrils flaring, ears twitching as if bracing for something invisible. One afternoon, Ellie invited Max Henley and Benji Harper, two classmates who had often struggled to fit in, to visit the ranch. Max suffered from severe social anxiety and rarely spoke above a whisper, while Benji, prone to overstimulation, tended to flinch at touch and sudden sound. Ellie introduced them to Shadow slowly, first from outside the paddock, then at a distance within. She instructed them to breathe calmly, speak low. It took time and patience, but eventually Shadow approached Max, not by command but by instinct. The boy's hands trembled, yet Shadow lowered his head until it gently brushed against Max's shoulder. Benji watched in stunned silence, then crept closer himself, and Shadow let him touch his mane. Mabel, watching from a distance, wiped at her eyes. "He remembers," she murmured. Word began to spread. A few parents reached out. A local therapist who had once worked with Thomas called to ask if she could observe. And then came the summer fair. Sagebrush Valley's annual fair was the sort of gathering that drew out nearly everyone in town. There were pie contests, hay bale mazes, live music, and a makeshift rodeo. Ellie had never planned to bring Shadow. The noise, the crowd, the fireworks, it all seemed too much for a horse so recently torn from the edge of despair. But Max and Benji's parents insisted. After what their children had experienced, they wanted others to see it too. So Ellie prepared. She sewed a makeshift therapy vest from canvas, painted Shadow's name on it, and trained in the quietest hours of morning, gradually introducing him to louder sounds, brighter lights. Shadow startled, but he did not break. Each day he recovered faster. Each day his trust in Ellie deepened. The night of the fair arrived with a chorus of crickets and distant music drifting through the hills. Ellie led Shadow through the back gate, away from the crowd, toward a quieter edge of the field. Max and Benji waited nearby, both visibly calmer at the sight of the Mustang. Families began to gather, murmuring as the black horse with the pale scar and calm eyes stood still amid the din. Then came the fireworks. A shrill whistle tore through the air, followed by an eruption of color and noise. Children squealed. A few horses reared in the rodeo pen. Ellie turned, panic rising in her throat, but Shadow didn't bolt. Instead, he stepped forward. Max had dropped to the ground, arms over his head, and Benji froze, shoulders shaking. Shadow moved between them, lowered his body slowly, and rested his head against Max's back. Silence fell in the small clearing. Even the music seemed to fade for a moment. Parents stared. A local news reporter snapped a photo. The therapist who had come to observe wiped her eyes. The next morning, the photo was everywhere. "The Mustang who heals," the caption read. People called, therapists, families, schools. Everyone wanted to know if Shadow was available. Then came the man in the black car. Dr. Malcolm Reeve introduced himself as a representative of Equicare, a national organization specializing in animal-assisted therapy. He wore a pressed suit, sharp glasses, and a smile that never reached his eyes. He complimented Ellie, praised her father's legacy, and made an offer so large that Sarah dropped her coffee cup. $200,000. He wanted to buy Shadow, move him to a national facility. Reeve said thousands of children could benefit, that Ellie would be credited in every brochure. Ellie said no, politely but firmly. Reeve's smile flickered. His voice dropped. "You're just a girl," he said. "You don't understand what a horse like this is worth." "He's not worth anything," Ellie replied. "He's not for sale." Mabel watched from the porch, arms folded, eyes narrowed. Reeve left, but something in the way he walked back to his car, the slow, measured steps, made Ellie feel as though this wasn't the end of the conversation, only the beginning. And that night, far beyond Sagebrush Valley, a name flickered onto a digital screen inside a dim office in Baltimore. Conrad Wallenstein. Equicare was never real, and the Mustang wasn't just a miracle. He was proof of everything they thought they'd buried. The nights in Sagebrush Valley had always carried a hush, the kind that lulled the world into forgetting itself. But that hush was long gone now. Ever since the fire, ever since the camera revealed the shadowy figure that had tried to end Shadow's life, the silence seemed less peaceful and more ominous, like a breath held before a storm. Ellie Dawson sat hunched over her father's old notebook at the dining table, her fingers tracing the initials MERP for the 100th time. The Mustang Early Response Project. Each time she read through the pages, she uncovered more evidence that her father had not only trained Shadow for therapy, but had perhaps been part of something deeper, something clandestine. She had told Mabel about the conversations she'd overheard between her father and unknown callers, how he'd always turned down research offers that wanted data over dignity, control over care. Now she feared one of those voices had returned. Across the table, Mabel sat with a steaming mug in hand, her eyes scanning a printed dossier she had quietly assembled over the last 2 weeks. She'd dug through her late husband's storage trunk, old contact logs from his days with the Agricultural Board, emails with the Rising Dawn board members, and even faded visiting cards left behind by men who'd come asking about the Mustangs. What she found wasn't just paperwork. It was a thread that, once pulled, began to unravel an entire fabric of deceit. Neurocore Dynamics, Mabel said, placing the latest document in front of Ellie. That's the company. They funneled money into Rising Dawn years ago, not public grants, not therapy donations, private capital. No strings attached on the surface, but hidden deep in the research files, they were building data on biological reactivity in equines, stress modeling, cortisol mapping, not for healing, but for predictive behavior analytics. Ellie felt her stomach turn. Shadow was their experiment. Mabel nodded. And your father was the only thing standing between them and complete control. When he refused to let Shadow continue under their protocols, the program was cut. But they didn't forget. The weight of the words settled like lead in Ellie's chest. She had always believed Shadow came into her life by chance, that her father's notes and her own instincts had converged into something beautiful. Now she realized they had been followed, marked. What she mistook for fate had been a fragment of a buried war her father had tried to end, and someone was still fighting to erase it. Sheriff Joe Holbrook came by later that afternoon, her boots coated in valley dust, her face carved with the lines of someone who'd stared at too many crimes without enough justice. She stepped inside without pretense, carrying a worn manila folder under one arm. Ellie and Mabel cleared space at the table. Holbrook laid out the photographs first. Close-ups of burn residue from the barn, fragments of metal soaked in accelerant, and, most telling of all, a sample of compound Z9 Delta. She tapped it with one blunt finger. Military grade, this isn't something teenagers steal from a gas station. It's engineered, used in labs that test neural conductivity. Neurocore has been flagged in 3 states for misreporting chemical use. Now we find it here. Mabel exhaled slowly. And what about the man in the footage? Facial enhancement came back, Holbrook said. She passed over a printout of a grainy, but now unmistakable image. He's not just anyone. He's Conrad Wallenstein. Ellie froze. That name was buried in her father's journal, once scribbled in the margins next to a meeting summary dated 3 years before his death. Holbrook continued. He operates under aliases now. The latest is Dr. Malcolm Reeve, supposed representative of a therapy foundation, Equicare. It's a shell. We trace their funding back to a Neurocore sub-account. They've been looking for Shadow. And when you wouldn't sell him, they tried to burn the evidence. Ellie stood so fast her chair scraped the floor. So, that man, he was here, pretending to be a donor. He touched Shadow. He walked through our barn. Holbrook gave a single nod. And he'll come back if he thinks we don't act. The following days blurred into a storm of motion. Sheriff Holbrook filed formal charges with the State Bureau and requested federal assistance. Ellie and Mabel turned the ranch into a fortress of evidence, locking away the notebook, scanning every file, every photograph. They made copies, backups, hid drives in metal cookie tins buried under fence posts. But the damage wasn't just legal. Shadow had regressed. Where once he'd begun to step toward children with tentative curiosity, now he stood rigid at the far side of his paddock. Ellie spent hours beside him, reading aloud her father's training notes, recreating whistle patterns, mimicking the calming breaths that had once brought the Mustang closer. Slowly, painfully, Shadow began to blink more often, to shift his weight nearer, as if he too knew the war wasn't over. One morning, Mabel received an email from an old colleague in Oregon who had once worked for a wildlife sanctuary before moving into private therapy. The message was short. "You're not crazy. We saw Wallenstein too. Be careful. He doesn't just erase data. He erases people." That night, Ellie couldn't sleep. The wind pushed at the windows and the sky burned with stars, indifferent to the fears of a girl and her horse. She stepped out onto the porch barefoot, the old boards cool against her skin. In the paddock, Shadow lifted his head and watched her. She stepped toward him, slowly, breathing steady, eyes soft, just as her father had taught her. When she reached the fence, she stopped and whistled, a low, steady three-note call. Shadow flinched, but then he stepped forward. One hoof, then another. Ellie held her breath. He pressed his muzzle gently against her outstretched hand. A whisper left her lips. "We're still here, and we're not going anywhere." Across the ridge, in a dark SUV parked behind a line of scrub pines, Conrad Wallenstein watched through high-powered binoculars. Behind him, in the back seat, a new file lay open, detailing permits for land acquisition near the valley. He scribbled one note across the margin of the folder in red ink. "If we can't buy her out, burn it all." The air over Sagebrush Valley felt heavier that morning, as if the land itself had sensed something shifting. A storm was coming, though the skies held no clouds. Ellie Dawson stood alone beside the paddock, one hand resting on the worn wooden rail, eyes fixed on the figure of Shadow as he moved in slow, careful circles. Every morning for the past week, she had rebuilt trust the way her father once had, with consistency, silence, and the kind of patience forged only through pain. Now, Shadow no longer flinched when she approached. He no longer turned away at the sound of her whistle. He knew she would come. And she knew he would wait. Across the kitchen, Mabel was already up, fingers tapping steadily at the keys of her ancient laptop. Dozens of files, video clips, scanned journal entries, emails, surveillance footage had been compiled and duplicated, backed up on hard drives and cloud accounts. They had spent sleepless nights preparing everything, and this morning their plan would be set into motion. Sheriff Hallbrook arrived just before dawn, headlights cutting across the gravel drive. She stepped inside without ceremony, a bundle of state-stamped documents tucked beneath one arm and a grim expression carved into her sun-weathered face. Ellie didn't need to ask. The warrant had been approved. "He's still operating under Reeve," Hallbrook said, setting the papers on the table. "And according to federal records, Neurocore Dynamics filed for a property acquisition permit northeast of the valley 3 days ago. That gives us legal grounds to investigate." She paused. "We're going after him today, but we need more than just paperwork. We need to catch him in the act." Ellie nodded. Her voice was calm, but her eyes betrayed the storm within. "Then we give him what he wants. We make him believe he can take Shadow." By midday, word had spread that the Morgan Hope Center was holding a public demonstration, an impromptu therapy session to showcase Shadow's progress. Flyers had gone out, invitations extended. The setup was simple: a temporary ring, folding chairs, a table with brochures Mabel had printed late into the night. And of course, Shadow. Families gathered, many bringing children who had already experienced his quiet magic. Max Henley stood near the fence, gripping his father's hand. Benji Harper sat cross-legged in the grass, whispering stories to a toy horse in his lap. Ruth Callahan handed out lemonade. It felt like a celebration. but for Ellie it was bait. Wallenstein arrived just past 2 o'clock. He wore the same polished smile, the same tailored blazer, stepping from a black SUV as if summoned by routine rather than motive. He greeted parents, shook hands, and complimented the program. No one seemed to notice the way his eyes scanned the property, how his gaze lingered on Shadow's every movement. Ellie approached him, steady and polite. She offered a brief tour, kept her voice level, played the part of the eager young handler. All the while, Sheriff Halbrook watched from the barn's loft, recording every word through a wireless mic clipped to Ellie's jacket. "He's everything you promised," Wallenstein said smoothly, his hand brushing Shadow's neck. The horse stiffened but didn't pull away, and more. "Have you reconsidered our offer?" Ellie looked up at him, eyes bright. "We have. In fact, we might be ready to negotiate." That night, while the last guest departed and the sun dipped low over the valley, Wallenstein returned. This time, he came alone. The ranch lay quiet. No lanterns burned, no voices stirred. But Shadow stood saddled in the paddock, as if awaiting transport. The barn doors were ajar. Wallenstein moved quickly, slipping through shadows with practiced ease. He pulled open the gate, reaching for Shadow's lead, only to find the horse stepping back, ears flat. Lights blazed on. Sirens followed. Sheriff Halbrook emerged from behind the truck, weapon drawn, flanked by 2 federal agents. Mabel stepped from the barn with a flash drive in hand, its contents already uploaded to 3 news outlets and the State Bureau. Ellie stood just behind the paddock gate, not triumphant but resolute. Wallenstein didn't resist. He didn't speak. But as the cuffs clicked into place, his expression twisted, not in anger, but in something colder. As if even now he believed himself untouchable. The trial unfolded over weeks, but the evidence spoke louder than any defense. Charges of arson, conspiracy, animal cruelty, and destruction of research property were stacked like sandbags. Neurocord dissolved under the weight of investigation, and Wallenstein's name became synonymous with corporate deceit. When the final verdict was read, Ellie sat beside Shadow, who had been granted full protection as a recognized therapy animal. The courtroom buzzed, but she heard only one voice, her father's, echoing from the pages of his journal. Healing isn't fixing. It's witnessing. It's presence. That spring, the Morgan Hope Center reopened in full. The new barn gleamed with cedar and glass, the paddocks expanded, the community rebuilt stronger than before. Ruth returned to offer weekly sessions. Families visited from counties away. And at the heart of it all stood Shadow, a Mustang once discarded, now a beacon. During the center's dedication ceremony, Ellie stepped forward with a medal in hand, a recognition awarded by the state for community service and therapeutic innovation. She didn't fasten it to her own shirt. Instead, she bent at the knee and clipped it gently to Shadow's halter. Her voice cracked only slightly as she whispered, "You didn't just survive. You saved me." Applause followed. But in that moment it was just the 2 of them. A girl and a horse. Both broken, both whole again. In Sagebrush Valley, legends weren't born. They were forged, in ash, in dust, and in trust that refused to die.